Welcome you all to something a little different. We're really pleased to have Joe Langley with us. He's a design engineer. He works for Lab for Living up in Sheffield. He's got a really broad experience of industrial and academic work and applying technical and creative design methods to developing interventions which focus on the healthcare sector. So absolutely highly relevant. And I say a little different because I think he's going to take us to a world we're slightly unfamiliar with. And some of us have been working more closely with him in relation to this seminar, and we've already had the joy of experiencing origami, understanding complex scenarios through relevant games based on lots of different sources of evidence, and Lego as well. So who knows what Joe's going to put us through this afternoon, but we do know that he is an absolute ace at combining designers' work and co-design, all of which are really relevant to implementation. So thank you so much, Joe. That'd be great. So over to you, and anybody who isn't Joe Langley, please switch off your camera and enjoy his talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Andre. I really appreciate that introduction. I'm just going to try and share my screen. So can everyone now see those slides?
Yes.
Super, thank you. So as Andre said, Joe Langley, design engineer, Lab for Living. I forgot to put the research centre website up there. It's just labforliving.org.uk, so you can find out a whole load more stuff about me and the work that myself and my colleagues do there. Today I'm going to talk us through two case studies and then take a bit of a left turn and go into what design is and design practice, but then relate that back to the two case studies. I'm then going to relate that to medical practice and other practices before coming back to what this whole seminar series is really focused on, which is the implementation. Before we get into that though, just a couple of quick things it might be useful. I often find it, something I often do during presentations is to print the screen to save information at relevant points. So I thought it might be useful to quickly share the controls and commands for doing that. Over the next two slides, I've condensed all of the sources and references I'm going to be using throughout the presentation. So that might be a couple of good opportunities to actually apply this. So these sources are, the first four are related to the first case study, Function First. The first output is published. The second and third ones will be published imminently. We've just had final proofreading and copyright stuff signed, so they should be online and available in the next month or so. The fourth one down here is available now. This is again related to that Function First case study, but it also pulls out a specific feature of that which is relevant to both the case studies and the sort of focal point of design practice that I'll bring into in at the end and relate to implementation. Finally, this last reference down here, this website, will take you to a web page on our website, which is a whole bunch of case studies from our practice and collaborators in Australia, where we really explored our own co-design practice throughout the pandemic, and really we were challenged by this, both looking at our pre-pandemic practice norms and really considering how they had excluded people. And this was all highlighted by the adaptations we had to make during the pandemic. There are a couple of publications on there as well, a journal paper and a book chapter. And I think some of that thinking that evolved out of the early trial and error phases of the co-design in a pandemic are really relevant to the second case study as well. These four sources are littered. My thinking relating to these four sources is littered throughout the presentation and throughout my work. I'd really recommend them if you haven't read them already. One I'm going to particularly draw your attention to here is the unflattening. This is inspirational in my book, and I think I shouldn't, like children, I shouldn't have a favorite, but I have to confess that this really is a sort of, in my view, a seminal work. It's a PhD thesis in comic strip form. You can get it from Amazon for £20, and I think it's well worth the money for each and every researcher to look at this and take on board the diversity that it brings to the ways in which knowledge can be created and shared, and how people can make sense of knowledge in different ways. So I'd really, really recommend people taking at that. And I have no financial gain to be made from this. It's not, I'm not plugging my own work here. But yeah, I'd recommend that. So getting on to the presentation more fully. The first case study, function first. Be active, stay independent. The project team was all of these people here. It was a really beautiful, diverse mix of people. We had sociologists, we had psychologists, we had sports and exercise scientists, we had an academic GP. I've got to doff my hat. I know she's actually online today. I think I've seen her name flag up, but Becky was a real inspiration in the leadership of this project. I felt that she gave us a lot of creative freedom for the design team in how we delivered our work within this project, but also challenged us on things, aspects of our work and why we were doing it and how we were doing it, which increased the credibility and rigor of what we were doing. So what was this about? Well, the rationale was on the basis that people with long-term conditions have difficulty performing usual activities, and this becomes more noticeable with the more long-term conditions that people have. And people with long-term conditions make up 50% of primary care GP appointments, which makes up 90% of all NHS contacts. So primary care makes a good context for an intervention to help people with long-term conditions maintaining their function. We also know there is a strong correlation between physical activity and physical function in older adults and adults with long-term conditions, and a wider relationship between physical function and other functions, social and cognitive. Finally, we also know it is really, really complex. So this obvious wide range of different types of long-term conditions, variations in geography, primary care settings, local resources available, and obviously as well people's lives, their home, family, work, financial setup, etc., etc. So the question we had for this project was, how best can primary care help reduce declining physical function and physical activity in people with long-term conditions? And we used realist evidence synthesis with embedded co-production and co-design. The planned process that we submitted in our process was beautiful. It was like this. It was this sequential series of steps with emerging and refining theories, program theories throughout the first stages, which would then feed into the co-design. We had co-design methods involved at this front end in the participatory theory building workshops. We used Lego as a medium to enable people to articulate and communicate their experiences, their lived experiences, and then draw out their nascent theories about why some things had worked for them and some things hadn't. And this became a sort of building block, a starting point for the literature review. From those nascent theories, we were able to identify things that related to literature and then explore those areas of literature. However, planned and reality are two very different things. And the extent of the literature was so vast that the literature review actually extended to a point where we couldn't delay the other steps of the process. We had to start the co-design and the inclusion theory. Now, I think, and I've spoken to Becky about this, if we had to rewrite this proposal now and redo this or another program of work using the same methods, this is how we would model it. There was a synergy between the realist synthesis and the co-design. Both are participatory, both are iterative. And it was the relationship between them sort of feeding information back and forth between the two. So the participants in the co-design would give their experiences and insights on things, which would then expand or shrink areas of or focus areas of the literature review. And then the literature review would be summarized and fed into the co-design so that those participants would know what was going on. What I want to focus on, I'm not going to go through the whole project. What I really want to focus on is this relationship, this interaction between how things were shared from the wider literature into the co-design process. And this point here as well, how these initial program theories were shared with the co-design partners. You'll notice that it is a progressive, as I said, iterative process. The theory areas sort of change and fluctuate as we expand and shift our understanding of things and refine these what's called CMOs, context mechanism outcome statements. So one of the methods we used to really build a strong relationship between the surrounding research and the co-design was this storyboarding method. So we storyboarded the process, explaining what had happened and what was going on. And that was presented on the walls in large format at every single co-design interaction, and was updated each time to show what had been going on within the surrounding research, what had happened at the last co-design event, so that if there were new faces at the next co-design interaction, they could kind of catch up really quickly. But it was this a really accessible, easy way of understanding what without consuming a huge amount of time with going over the research again and again and again at each event. But I think what was most interesting and important, and I think relates again to the second case study and to the remote co-design work, is this use of the if-then card. So those first program theories that came out, we distilled, Becky and her team distilled into these if this then that statements. And what we did was we separated those out and created a set of if this cards, then that cards. And at the co-design event, the first co-design event, the partners in small groups played these games with the cards. So they would turn a couple over and see whether they matched and argue and debate amongst themselves whether they did match or didn't. And some were obvious, and some were less clear and more ambiguous. And that created discussion, and people were drawing on their experiences to then expand those discussions. Another format we played where they turned them all over and tried to match them into pairs between them. And what this did was it was rather than us just simply presenting on a screen or a piece of paper a list of if this, then that statements, these forms of interaction enabled the co-design partners to interact with the evidence in a way that deepened their understanding, but deepened it in the context of their experiences. Simultaneously, it was a structure and a forum for enabling them to share their experiences with each other. So through their debates and their exchanges, this then expanded, these small groups expanded their understanding of the literature and their shared understanding of each other's experiences. So this moved beyond a simple form of knowledge translation or communication as we're telling you what happened, to this deeper, richer form of knowing. A specific outcome of the realist synthesis is these context mechanism outcome statements. And we had, in the end, 5 of these. Now, I'm not going to go through them in detail. They're hugely relevant, but you can look back at the references that I showed you at the start to find out more about those in detail. The other 3 are there. The reason why I've put them up is to show you that these were also fed into the co-design process as they were refined in various forms. We separated out C, M, and O cards, and people were playing with those cards as well, again, arranging them or trying to arrange various different versions or forms of context mechanism outcome statements in this same way of trying to enrich their understanding of what made sense and what didn't in the context of their experiences. What this meant was that through the co-design process, the things that were actually designed, the ideas they came forward and how we interrogated those ideas and moved them forward, were fundamentally informed by the evidence basis, as well as by the experiences of the co-design partners. And we were able to point to specific features of the final intervention and say, this feature embodies context mechanism outcome statement 2 or CMO 1 and 5. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of that to illustrate what I mean. So in this first one of the things that came out of context mechanism outcome 2 was that the resources need to be in synergy rather than competition with other initiatives. So as a way of enabling others to see that we weren't competing, that they could adopt these if it fitted with their program, with their initiative, just being able to have, rather than competing for a hierarchy of brand, just say, you can stick your brand here. It's a really simple step, but actually it reduces those barriers of not invented here, we can't use it. The 2 boxes really distilled down to a set of resources for the primary care practices and a set of resources for working with patients with long-term conditions in one-to-one or group consultations. And this first box was all about how the practice itself could change its culture, its understanding and its knowledge, and then support more active environments within the practice for its staff and its patients. And then this one was about helping and supporting people to make sense of, prioritize things within their life, find out their preferences for various different forms of physical activity, and sort out how that might fit into the complexity of their individual and personal life. And as you can see, as I said, each element within this is underpinned and relates to specific context, mechanism, outcome statements at a general level. And we can point to specific features within these at a more granular level that do the same thing. Again, I'm going to pick out a couple of examples. So in the practice set of resources, there were these non-prescription pads and an active practice poster, how the practice itself could be restructured, reorganized and rearranged to just, for example, simply encourage a patient who wasn't too ill to walk to move more around the waiting room, whether it's at the sign-in and check-in, going to the desk and going to different areas, whether there's standing waiting rather than sitting waiting, all of these different features. The non-prescription pads was about the credibility of physical activity as a medical intervention, where the credibility of it perceived against perhaps a drug or a medication might not be, from the patient's perspective, given as much credibility. So this was about trying to elevate that sense of credibility. And on the patient set of resources, one of the things which we pulled out was this guided card game. So cards are a really, really nice format that a lot of designers use. And there's a number of reasons for that. In sort of shared group context, co-design and so on, they are a format where people understand the unspoken rules about taking turns, one person following another. When you apply color and other coding to them, you can use it to enable comparisons, make relationships, order things, give focus on smaller sets. And through a guided, structured card game, we're envisaging that this could be used to enable someone to explore what they prioritized and what they valued within their lives, how that might fit within their working life and the resources they had available to themselves, and then use that to refine down a subset of priorities and availability of physical activity opportunities, and then reach their own prescription. So this would be almost like a self-prescription. This is something I'm going to come back to. I'm going to refer back to this later on. We also developed a digital extension of this. So it wasn't just physical resources. There was a digital element to this as well. This is at the moment all still relatively conceptual. We have the components of this built and designed, but we're just working with Nevin Williams now to apply for larger grant funding to take this into more formal evaluations. So the second case study, serious incident investigations. Again, I'm going to whiz through this. I'm not going to pull out all the details of this case study. So this is working with the wonderful team in Bradford Institute for Health Research, led by Jane O'Hara, not the Brad Hole Institute, but this project. And it is, you can find out more details from this. There's a website, web link on this Twitter page. It is a current project, so it's ongoing at the moment. So that's another reason why there's limited referencing around it at the moment. The aim was to develop and test new processes and guidance to support the involvement of patients and families in serious incident investigations. And we're going to do this across 3 settings: mental health hospitals, acute hospitals, and national investigations. Choosing those 3 contexts because we believed at the start that there were going to be subtle and perhaps some less subtle variations in how investigations are conducted and the value that patients and families can bring to these, and also the challenges of involving patients and families in these different contexts. So the rationale is that there are around 10,000 reported serious incidents per year, the huge variability in how they're conducted, and an ever-increasing costs of litigation. The reasons why people pursue these claims are, it's really complex and unclear, but one answer we've heard quite a lot of is that people often end up taking this route simply to get answers. Organizational learning is a stated aim of investigations, and I stress the stated aim of investigations. Patients and families are not routinely involved, and we suspect that this is missing a key perspective of understanding what went wrong, which has an impact on learning. We also wanted to explore how involvement might impact the people making claims and the sense of justice or healing that patients and families would have. So the process we followed was this: research, synthesis, co-design, and evaluation. We're partway through the co-design right now. So in the research stage, we looked at policies, in serious investigation policy statements from, I think, nearly 70 trusts. There was a review of literature, and then interviewed patients and families, investigators, and staff who had been investigated as well. And what I really want to focus on again is how the link between the research and the co-design. So in the synthesis stage, we ended up developing a set of common principles, and these were draft. So these were something we didn't finalize. We wanted to take these to the co-design partners. But we also adopted a restorative learning lens based on the evidence that had come out. We realized that this idea of restoration and healing was really fundamental to enabling patients and families to have a healing, and important in ensuring that there wasn't any increased harm as a result of them being involved in investigations, especially if investigations that are then done badly. Again, this was a piece of work we submitted the proposal and won the funding for before COVID. So back then, life was much simpler. We had adopting our then norm for co-design. We had face-to-face interactions defined as our sort of go-to co-design approach. There was going to be a stakeholder events that brought all of the co-design teams together from all three settings, and then we would break out down into 3 parallel work streams, each work stream having 2 co-design workshops. And then we would come back for this final event that brought everyone back together and looked at the differences between what had been designed for the 3 settings to understand whether they were really relevant differences or just idiosyncrasies of the people in those co-design work streams. But COVID forced us to really adapt. And this is where that web page link, I think, might be really useful to expand some of your understanding. So moving to low contact co-design, this is still new, really new for us. And we had a lot of trial and error in the first few months, but it presented opportunities. Our first steps were, like everyone else, we jumped onto digital platforms, but we really quickly got responses and feedback that this alone was excluding people who couldn't actually be present because of digital access and inclusion issues, but also issues with relationships between people and the ability to relate, to empathize with, to create ideas and to build on ideas. So this project really benefited from all of those early experiments that we did in all the other projects. And what we realized was, one of the things that we realized is that actually you can't possibly get everything into a 2-hour online workshop that we might have got into a 2-hour face-to-face workshop. There's a whole bunch of unspoken interactions which augment and amplify the exchanges and engagements in the face-to-face. So what we did was we took out some of those elements to enable people to reflect individually and build their wider appreciation from other perspectives before they ever came to these face-to-face digital and online events. And there was a series of 2 packs that we sent out. So I'm going to focus on the second one purely for time pressures. So going back to the synthesis, we took the literature and distilled it into a series of vignettes. There wouldn't be any recognizable single story within any of these vignettes, but they all drew on and related to the evidence that we've got from the interviews and the literature and so on. As a design group, we then drew inspiration from 2 other sources. One of these was this Building Stories kit, and the other is this Romeo and/or Juliet. So this is the first is a kit that you get with a number of different stories, which tells the story of a building from multiple perspectives. It goes through the seasons, and you see the changes in the building and the people inside it. There's one example where you see the story of a couple in one apartment from one half of the couple, telling a little bit of the story. And then you see the perspective of someone in an apartment over the street looking in and their view of that couple. And in the Romeo and/or Juliet, this is where you can change parameters within the story and choose which direction the narrative goes in. So taking these ideas, we developed this kit which went out to people. Everything within this was really fundamentally based on the evidence that we'd taken from the research stages. And there was a vast amount of evidence. There was, as I say, nearly, I think, 50 or 60 interviews, 60 to 70 policy documents had been reviewed, and the literature. So in this kit, the first set of cards you see, again, we as designers, we're leaning on that idea of using cards because it allows people to see things in relation to each other. The blue cards set out a specific incident like you might get in a datex form. The yellow cards then become the role of the investigator. The person playing this game or using this kit defines an investigator, and then is limited to a certain number. You can't use all of the evidence in the deck. You shuffle them and draw a certain number. And this defines the evidence that you, as an investigator, will be made aware of. And you then lay that evidence out and you make a decision then about what the investigation has found and discovered. We then invite the person using this kit to step out of that role and reflect on the process they've just been through before going in and using the kit again, defining another investigator, an alternative investigator, drawing a different set of evidence and going through the same process and seeing whether they come to a different conclusion. The final set of cards, the blue cards, talks about things that the investigator may never, ever actually find out about. These are the long-term impacts, things that happen to the patient, the family, things that happen to the staff involved. And it gives, as the person using the kit, it gives them an understanding of some of these things that an investigator may never actually be aware of. So we didn't do this as a way of saying this is what investigation should be. What we were doing was drawing on the evidence to say, this is the complexity of investigations as they now stand. This is the variability. And this is the way that different perspectives can see the same incident from very different ways. There are multiple truths, in a sense, within these investigation processes, within these incidents, the serious incidents that happen. We're now continuing this process. We're between co-design workshops 1 and 2. We've just sent out another kit, which is around taking the ideas that have been developed and enabling our co-design partners to play with those and interrogate them further. This has had some sensitivities related to it because of the harm that has been done to some of our co-design partners. And we're also engaging staff who have been investigated and staff who have carried out investigations. Yet the responses we've had to this as a co-design process have been really positive. The level of engagement that people are showing, they're demanding that we give them more to do rather than sort of stepping back and drifting off. So I think the early indications, all anecdotal, are hugely positive that the approach we've taken in this, whilst having flaws, has been positive. Now, relating these 2 case studies to the design practice, George Cox who was director of the UK Design Council back in 2005, I think, was commissioned by George, who was it? The Prime Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, to do a review of creativity in industry. And he defined design as the link between creativity and innovation. Design as a sector is diverse. You've got graphic design, service design, fashion design, industrial design, product design, lots of different designs. It's also a discipline with skills, body of knowledge, degrees and qualifications, professional bodies, academic disciplines of design research. And it's a ubiquitous term. It's a pattern, a plan, a purpose, an intent. Research design is really just methodology. It's also a paradox. It bridges between engineering and art. It's about function and form. It's both a really young profession and yet one of the oldest human endeavors, it going back to the earliest times of mankind, where we've tried to improve our circumstances. And it's also a highly skilled discipline and profession, and yet a universal human trait. Everyone tries to improve their circumstances. What is not often talked about with regards to design from those outside the profession is the relationship that design has with our material culture. Design is really fundamentally about shaping, molding, exploring, and playing with the material world to work things out, express and communicate things. This is how design research functions as a form of inquiry or research through design. All of us surround ourselves with materials and visual objects that we invest with meaning and value. We need or want these things, and we define them just as they in turn define us. The emotional value that we place in an object or a device, the way we relate to it, tells me something about that person. And throughout our entire history, we've been exploring the world in this way, inventing and innovating through this exploration with our material world. Whether it's tools to expand our agency or objects that express our values and our personality, the forms and functions we create in objects have helped us to evolve. Design combines form, function, materials, and experiences. Even the simplest of things can be transformational when taking a design approach. A heavy object on a stick can be a hammer. But taking the head out of different materials, making the head out of different materials, gives us the ability to hammer different materials with different effects, whether it's punching, shaping, molding, patterning. The size, shape, weight, material of the hammerhead expands our activity. And the shape of the handle can be designed in such a way as to encourage a user to hold it in a specific way that optimizes its use. It increases the agency of the user. This isn't simply about guiding the user, like a set of guidelines. This agency wouldn't exist without the hammer. And this is similar with road signs. This road signs we have in the UK is a seminal system of simplistic graphic design that conveys really complex information to people who are already multitasking when you're driving, and people who only have a fleeting moment to take in the information. It presents a hierarchy of information, and the system as a whole is sequenced. So it sequences the information, giving the drivers just the right information they need at the right time, gradually expanding the depth of information as they approach a decision point. So design as a practice, it is a practice. It's supported by skills, knowledge, tools, mindsets, and a process. But design itself isn't just a process. And I really want to stress this. Without the skilled person determining adjustments to the process that suit a specific project or context of application, the process is just a formula, a guide. But design practice is most importantly about bridging between knowledge and imagination, what we know and how we want to improve our circumstances. And without imagination, if we only ever confined ourselves to the limits of what we know now as the best that we can ever be, we would still be living in caves and chasing animals around with clubs. We've got to extend our knowledge to new imagined possibilities, which by definition are uncertain and novel. And so the process can only ever be a guide. It needs a skilled navigator of unknown territory to know when the guide is not suitable. Reducing design merely to a process would inherently limit the level of novelty and imagination that can be engaged and achieved, because the lack of skills to navigate new territory will constrain and force those following the process to stay safe within the territory they're familiar with. The two central features of design practice are that designers are using their practice to learn about new things really quickly. So if everything is about a new future, a new possibility, then it's this ability to learn about new things really, really quickly. Not proficiently. We're not trying to be the expert in something, but just good enough to work with other experts and just good enough to give shape to those ideas and test them out. The other central feature, so that's the first. The second one is about combining different strands of often competing, even conflicting knowledge, and trying to synthesize them. This is why designers, I think, are often jacks of all trades and masters at learning new trades, just to a good enough level. So these competing things are really important. They're really broken down into these 5. Competing strands of knowledge can be expert forms from different disciplines for sure, but actually they fall into these 5 categories. There's functional and technical aspects around feasibility. There's financial aspects. There's user aspects. There's life cycle and sustainability and impact. And holding all of these strands of knowledge is obviously really clearly a nightmare of layers and layers of dynamic complexity, where there are interactions between all of these, and every one of these can change as well. And you make a change to one of these around how something is technically realized, and it'll have an impact on usability, the life cycle, and the price point or the cost. And this is where one of the central components of design practice around managing this complexity is visualization. And I really want to again stress that in visualization, I include prototyping. Prototyping is merely a form of 3-dimensional visualizing, 2D and 3D. So visualizing in the first stages of design is often how designers get to grips with a new topic area, something we are not familiar with, representing relevant knowledge from specific domains in ways that we, lay people to those domains, can understand and explore. Later, the visualization is then used to see how different strands of knowledge and information interact and fit together. And this is a bit like trying to fit different jigsaw puzzles together when they have no picture, but it's worse because the puzzle pieces are changing in shape and size. When we vary things around the technical specification of something, it will have an impact on the shape and size of these other bits as well. What we're doing is constantly seeing things in relation to each other to get an idea of coherence. And visualization is used in symbolic and metaphorical ways to explore experiences and emotions, but also in practical ways to explore functions, and in systems to explore interactions. So come back to that example from the Function First project. We can see how these practices, we've transferred them into the intervention, trying to enable others to use them to see the complexity of their lives in relation to what resources they have, what values they have, priorities, goals, physical activity opportunities, etc. This guided process enables them to sort through, rationalize, prioritize, operationalize, plan, and map. Just going back to the visualization and practice of design, and I'm going to take architecture as an example. From the low resolution beginnings, the 2D and 3D visuals are used to explore problem solution spaces. This is fundamental to the way designers think and puzzle through the challenges of shaping the various pieces of the jigsaw and fitting them together. So the process of making these visualizations is more important than the visualization at the end. As coherence emerges, these visualizations then become tools for communicating to multiple audiences, tailoring the information to suit. The complexity is laid up into different trades or production requirements. Blueprints are sent to civil engineers or steel beam specifications. Power, lighting, data wiring schematics are sent to an electrician. Plumbing schematics sent to a plumber. Site access and organization plans are sent to the project manager. Different forms and different expressions to different people. And this is true of all design disciplines. Design is not just about the pretty visuals. Fashion design, graphic design, any design discipline. Designers have in-depth knowledge about the materials, the production processes, the way the materials are shaped and formed, and they share technical information and requirements with those that need it in a form that fits them, their practices and their processes. So the type of material, the dye used, the cuts, the nesting of different parts of a t-shirt into a sheet of fabric, the method of cutting, the types of stitching and hems, all of this detail is collated by the designers to fit into the coherent picture of how everything works together, and then translated into visuals to be shared to specific disciplines for their aspect of making and bringing something together and spanning those boundaries. And service design is no different. Service designers don't just map touch points or on experience journeys and the associated emotional responses by service users. We also look at the technical and human detail of making those touch points and experiences happen. What resources are needed? When are they needed? How are they delivered? This is service design led by designers. In co-design processes led by designers, we use design practices to enable others to think as designers, to represent the various jigsaw pieces in relation to each other and explore how each jigsaw piece can change and how all the jigsaw pieces can then fit together in a variety of ways. We start with their experiences, enabling them to map out and visualize and see their experiences in relation to others' experiences and bring those shared experiences together. All of these terms have been widely used to describe what design is, and all of them are true. I think there are some missing from here, and I'll bring those in a bit. And what is not described is that design practice brings all these things together. It's not design process. So design process doesn't bring in, I don't know, intuition or optimism or empathy. That's the person, that's the design practice. If we bring a little bit of coherence to all those terms, if I try and bring a little bit of coherence to all those terms, I see all of these things as moving across the screen from right to left. We start off with wicked problems and have to apply systemic thinking around that whole process, but particularly around how we explore the front end. But we use prototyping and visualization throughout to see relationships between things and to try and bring a sense of coherence to the problem, not trying to understand all the elements of the problem. That's too complex, it's dynamic. It's, in one sense, there's no point because the understanding, as soon as you've obtained it, is out of date. We use a human-centered, empathetic and narrative-focused approach. And we use, because it's complex and an inability to understand everything all in one go, this is the iterative and inductive approach that we use as well. So how does this relate to medical practice and other practices? Well, here I'm going to lean really heavily on Catherine Montgomery. And when I read this, I was really inspired. She says that medicine isn't a science tool and nor is it an art, it's a practice. And she underlines all these things that this is uncertain, paradox laden, judgment dependent, science using, etc. But then she goes on to talk about it as this retrospective narrative investigation. And this is where I was kind of really bowled over. The narrative rationality, the diagnostic process is around trying to create a coherent narrative that explains all of the things that are known and tries to fill in the gaps of the unknowns whilst being contextually and culturally situated. And as I was reading this, I was thinking, so it's about storytelling narratives, it's applying abductive knowledge, it deals with uncertainty and complexity. And going on, there's this real-time synthesis, trying to synthesize different bits of evidence from various different symptoms, physical signs, what you know about the person, their test results, etc. They're looking at a plurality of sources of evidence. And when you think about it, or when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, actually, you could say that law is the same, or design, or any other real-world practice where there is this interaction with a dynamic changing system where dealing with people, everything is unique. There's some commonality, but actually everything is completely unique. And this goes then to the sorts of knowledge that people are using in these circumstances, in these situations. And I should have had, obviously I should have had a reference to Andre and John's mind lines here, because it's exactly that. But I think there's something else as well that I'm trying to draw upon. It's not just how the instrumental things that people are doing, people are using these extended forms of cognition, interacting with the world, not just in an instrumental way, but with a whole body form of cognition in these experiential learning cycles. And practice knowledge isn't simply about knowing a set of scientific rules and applying them, as perhaps science would like it to be. It's about understanding evidence and knowing how to adapt it and how to blend it with the rules from other sources of evidence, making just good enough guesses. But that understanding of the evidence requires it to be presented in forms that are familiar, that fit with the practice. And this is, I think, moving on to the implementation, I think this is the thing where we break down the gap between evidence and practice. And I think there's something missing. So let's be honest, we're not talking about any evidence. We're talking about the gap between research evidence and practice. And I think that means between science and practice. And traditionally, the gap has been perceived as this instrumental thing. So it's cognitively what I know, getting that into someone else's brain. And yes, I know it's not just perceived as an instrumental gap. Researchers have done lots of work to recognize that there are organizational factors and other practical factors that need shaping and adjusting to support implementation. But if we set aside some of those contextual variables just for a moment, I think there's something fundamentally different about the way that practitioners think. In design, we talk about thinking with our hands, a whole body extended cognition. And this is what doctors are doing all the time as well. This is what practitioners in law are doing. Researchers don't appreciate, value, or accommodate this form of thinking and how they share their evidence to suit that thinking. And that's where I think the gap lies. So, and it's ironic as well, because actually researchers develop their evidence in these forms of, they might apply extended forms of cognition in their research, but then it's condensed down into these words, these texts. Okay, you now visuals and media files as well, but it's about translating a instrumental cognitive form of evidence into someone else's mind, rather than practical narrative forms of evidence, practical forms of evidence and narrative forms of evidence. And I think that this is where the ways in which designers develop knowledge and knowing through these forms of extended cognition actually begin to plug some of those gaps. So those games, those card games that we developed, the if-then card game, the CMO card game, the serious investigations card game, they allow people to interact with the evidence for themselves rather than just being simply told this is what the evidence said. They can play with it, they can change it, they can try it in different contexts, in different scenarios for different people, move it around, shape it, and that gives them this richer, deeper sense of knowing the evidence rather than just parrot fashion learning. So the creative practices of design and other creative disciplines provide this way of enabling critical embodied forms of interaction with evidence and research processes. And again, as John said earlier before we started, or I can reference Kate Beckett's work with the Forum Theatre here as well, because that sits in the same body of creative disciplines. They enable ways of playing with evidence, trying it out, whereby people can use extended forms of cognition to get a sense of what the evidence and data means to them in the context of their experiences and develop these embodied ways of knowing. These practices can be of use to researchers, professionals, policymakers, anyone. And they can help to bridge the gap between evidence, knowledge, knowing, and practice, transforming instrumental stuff into embodied forms that fit with the forms of extended cognition that people then use in their practice. The challenge for research in general is that it accepts and works with other forms of knowledge and knowing, not trying to copy them or extract the bits perceived as valuable whilst discarding the rest. And again, I'll go to unflattening here. It's not the difference between the perspectives or ways of knowing that is the problem, it's how they are combined. As Nick points out in Unflattening, our bodies are built based on this principle. Each eye that we have is a different perspective. What you see with one eye is different to what you see with the other. It's the way that those two images are combined in our brains that gives us depth and texture and richness to the world that we see. But that can't happen in a hierarchical frame. It's got to value all of the, have to be equal value to all of the perspectives to make real change. So again, this is where the spectrum of the evidence hierarchy can be dangerous and I think damaging. There isn't a hierarchy at all. It's a spectrum from qualitative to quantitative methods. We can get good and bad evidence from any method across that spectrum. We can get credible, incredible, and incredulous evidence from any of those methods. What we need is a mixture of good, credible evidence from a wide range of those methods and sources, combined to give us a rich and complex knowledge from which we can then conceive new possibilities and make them work. I'm currently editing a special issue of Evidence and Policy called Creativity in Co-Production, and we've been working with some amazing authors from around the world. And we've had a couple of opportunities to bring some of them together as well. And we hope to do more of that in the autumn. So it's going to be published in December, and I'd really recommend having a look at read of those articles and the surrounding blog and podcast that we'll put out with it. I think that's going to expand wonderfully on some of the ideas that I've alluded to here, give far more concrete sort of evidence and theory behind them. I think at that stage, I'm going to say thank you very much. And I hope that was of value and use to you in some way, shape or form. Thank you.
Joe, it was not just of value in some way, shape or form. It was utterly stunning. I was all the time you were talking, when you started, I was thinking about the Japanese film Rashomon, which probably just shows my age, but it shows you how the different perspectives